Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Grayzone. Another momentous week. Sorry about being a little late there. Aaron told me he was going to be late, so I made sure that I was. But I wound up
That's true.
being a little. I wound up being a little later. But I thought it was important to have all our pieces in place. There will be some. We're working on something relating to the subject of the Washington Post smearing us kind of in real time. So I was hoping we'd have it ready by the time of this stream, and we'll see if that's the case. Yeah. So welcome, Aaron. How's everything going?
It's going good, Max. Good to see you and good to see everybody here. Thanks for joining us. Be sure to like this stream and share it so that more people can see it. And yeah, you've already published one response, Max, to that Washington Post hit piece on us, which then metastasized into more forms of disinformation, parroting a complete lie that were funded by Russia and Iran. And even though the Washington Post corrected their initial story, other people desperate to smear us in any way ran with the pre-corrected version and then put their own spin on it. And anyway, we'll get into that. But it's just for all the talk about disinformation, this story was a classic example of how disinformation spreads. It comes from the people who claim to be concerned with this information.
Yep. The greatest propagators of disinformation are our corporate and legacy media. And we'll get into that. It's actually funny. The Pentagon has put out an alert about coverage of the Israeli massacre in Nuseirat refugee camp that took place 3 days ago. Well, more like 2.5 days ago. And they're claiming that those who are pointing to a U.S. role in this hideous massacre, one of the worst of the assault on the besieged Gaza Strip, are engaged in disinformation, and they're extremely concerned about this. And the idea that the U.S. didn't play any role in this is just absolutely sick. I don't know where to start here. But I think we should start with the footage of the conclusion of this raid on Nuseirat, and then we'll kind of we'll start from the end and kind of go backwards. This is a summary by our friend Afshin Ratanzi on how the Nuseirat massacre unfolded. Israel used the U.S.-built Humanitarian pier to sneak in a unit of Israeli soldiers and reportedly American soldiers. Now, we don't know if that part is true, but we'll see from the imagery something that is just undeniable. The soldiers boarded a humanitarian aid truck and drove to Nuseirat refugee camp. That appears to be substantiated and true. Once inside, they're discovered by Palestinians, which resulted in nonstop Israeli aerial bombardment, and the soldiers opened fire inside the central market, killing over 210 and injuring hundreds. Death tolls now over 270 and 700 wounded. An absolute bloodbath. The humanitarian pier gets exposed to be an occupation, assassination, and massacre pier. The Americans cannot be trusted. And look at this. This is that is the Israeli helicopter awaiting the arrival of the rescued hostages. And you can even see Hebrew writing on what looks like destroyed structures on the beach because of the presence of the Israeli military. And behind it, these are American Army and trucks, along with aid trucks, on the aid pier that we warned at the Grayzone months ago would be used for destructive military operations and would put U.S. military personnel in harm's way. There's an Israeli soldier speaking Hebrew. So you get the point. Obviously, the U.S. is freaked out about this footage. This was the response by CENTCOM to discussion about that footage. The humanitarian pier facility, including its equipment, personnel, and assets, were not used in the operation to rescue hostages today in Gaza. An area south of the facility was used by the Israelis to safely return the hostages to Israel. Any such claim to the contrary is false. The temporary pier on the coast of Gaza was put in place for one purpose only: to help move additional, urgently needed life-saving assistance into Gaza. And this is how I responded, which is an area south of the facility was used by the Israelis. Like how far south? Like a few meters? I mean, just look how close that helicopter is. It would have been absolutely impossible for Israel to have pulled this off with the helicopter on the ground unless they were doing so in an area that had been completely secured. And this is an area that is apparently secured by U.S. mercenaries for the offloading of humanitarian aid. It doesn't look like Hamas is declaring the U.S. to be a combatant. It hasn't prior to this point. But now, all bets are off, and it looks like the Pentagon is just lying. Aaron, what are your thoughts?
Well, look, let's assume for a second they're telling the truth, which I also am highly suspicious of, given especially the pier was a fake stunt to begin with. There was never any intention of being serious about delivering aid. It was just there to distract from the fact that Biden was not pressuring Israel to drop its blockade, its land blockade of Gaza. And this was a PR stunt to distract from that. So it's perfectly consistent to me that the cynical administration would let that pier be used for an actual military operation against Gaza. But let's assume for a second that it's not. No matter whether the pier was directly involved or not, the Biden administration was directly complicit in this massacre. They supplied intelligence to Israel and who knows what else. In fact, Jake Sullivan was asked about this on ABC News, and he gave a very vague response.
With American support for this mission in Israel, in Gaza, the U.S. provided support for that mission. Was it just logistical or intelligence help, or were they part of the planning?
Well, first, Martha, we didn't have any U.S. forces on the ground. Second, we've been working for months to support Israel in its efforts to rescue and recover hostages from Gaza, including the American hostages. And there weren't Americans among these four. But I'm not going to speak further to intelligence or operational matters because we need to protect their sensitivity.
So the only thing he says there is we didn't have forces on the ground. But he did not rule out an operational role, because he said, I'm not going to speak to intelligence or operational matters, which means that the U.S. may have had an operational role. I think, to me, that's a confirmation that they did. And obviously, it's known from other reports that they supplied intelligence. So whatever the specifics are, the Biden administration is complicit in this massacre, which, as you said, left over 275 Palestinian civilians dead. And there are even reports, actually, I haven't verified this yet, but there were reports that maybe Israeli hostages were killed as well. 4 were rescued, but I believe the Al-Qassam brigades claimed, and I haven't seen it verified, so who knows, but that is what they said, that Israeli hostages were killed in this operation.
Yep. According to the Al-Qassam brigades, 3 hostages were killed in the course of this operation, including one with an American passport. And I haven't seen any independent confirmation, but they've generally told the truth about what was taking place on the ground. For example, when they released a video featuring one of the hostages who was rescued, Noah Argamani, detailing how she was attacked by Israeli airstrikes, had shrapnel in her head, and 2 of the Israeli hostages who were with her were killed in that airstrike. That has been corroborated by Argamani's testimony since being released. So I think there are more terrible details to come. But Jake Sullivan, I don't know if this was him jumping the gun. He hailed The Israeli operation, which was a straight up massacre, which included 7 bombings, helicopters firing everywhere, executions on site by special forces, as a daring operation. Today, Israeli security forces conducted a successful operation to rescue 4 hostages from the grips of Hamas in Gaza. The United States is supporting all efforts to rescue the hostage, secure the release of hostages still held by Hamas. And then this is a key line. This includes through ongoing negotiations or other means. First of all, daring operation, successful operation. In what world is the killing of close to 300 people and the wounding of 700 and the possible killing of 3 hostages in order to rescue 4 hostages a successful operation? The operation was actually botched. The mass killings that took place, the bombings, destruction of an entire market, all the body parts that flowed into hospitals of children, the video of children dying in their parents' arms. All of this was because the Israelis were found out. Their deception failed, and they couldn't reach their point or be extracted without massive death, havoc, and destruction. And Jake Sullivan's calling that successful? Did he not know? Well, we can be sure that he greenlighted this operation, and the U.S. has blood all over its hands. Go ahead, Aaron, you're muted.
Well, sorry, I was muted. We're dealing with people who don't see Palestinians as equal human beings, because you can't say the mass slaughter of 275 plus people is a success unless you don't see the people who were killed as human beings. It's just what it comes down to. It's the only world in which that is a success is if you're a sociopath, and that's what these people are. They're just completely cut off from the notion that Palestinians are equal human beings. They can't process that thought.
Yeah, I mean, this is all they seem to care about, like the Israelis, is Jewish life. And I can't show any of the footage of the aftermath of the massacre just because we'll immediately be demonetized and suppressed even more than we currently are. Elon Musk's X has deleted footage I and others tweeted showing disemboweled bodies and body parts at Al-Aqsa Hospital. Just horrific footage. And Blinken and Jake Sullivan hailed this entire operation without even mentioning civilian casualties. So at the same time, Blinken is back in the region. He's in Israel right now to pose as an honest broker, demanding that Hamas just take these terms. They're trying to completely hijack all ceasefire negotiations at the United Nations and reject any other country's input. And at the same time, they're sponsoring massacres inside Gaza. We have some footage of testimony from an eyewitness to the massacre in Nuseirat, and I cannot vouch for the accuracy, but I think it needs to be considered. What he's saying is very provocative. This is a young boy from Nuseirat. And he's saying that look, we'll just quote the key part here. We saw a group of special forces, American special forces. Those who attacked us in our homes were not Israeli forces. They were American. And Biden, the guy who talks about American humanitarian aid who built the pier, is bringing tanks through the pier. And the person who killed my brother is one of them from Biden's army. That's essentially what this witness was saying. I don't know if it's true. There is speculation about the uniforms of those involved in the rescue team, but the U.S. claims there were no troops on the ground. One thing we can be fairly certain of is that Israel and Israeli special forces used humanitarian aid as a Trojan horse in order to penetrate Nuseirat refugee camp. There's footage of an aid truck going in along with other trucks. And here's a witness who is shot on site by the Israelis, describing how he was, what he saw.
كله أواعي وكله قناعة.
And I don't know where the, well, I don't know where there were supposed to be subtitles. Yeah, I guess the subtitled version is elsewhere, but he's essentially saying that those who fired on him were carrying aid and were dressed as aid workers.
Yeah, there's a photograph going around of someone being shot, a passerby being shot from the fake aid truck. So
Yeah.
Israel, and doing this, on top of doing this commit war crimes, doing this also endangers actual aid workers, because now that just raises the suspicion that foreign aid workers in Gaza could be Israelis in disguise. Who knows what kind of accidents that could lead to. There's a reason why such activity is banned. You're not allowed to pretend to be aid workers. That's supposed to be sacrosanct. And in terms of this young man's testimony about seeing Americans, I mean, one possibility is, there are Americans who serve in the Israeli army. So that could have been it too, where he just sees Israeli soldiers and they're speaking in American accents. Obviously, it's impossible to know, but that's just one possibility. Because personally, I doubt that this is something the U.S. would cover up like that. Like, that's a pretty daring thing to risk being exposed. And for Jake Sullivan to go and say there are no U.S. forces on the ground, to lie about that, I'd be very surprised if that were the case. But again, with these people, you never know.
Here is video showing the aid truck going in. You can see it right there. Now watch what comes after it. And there was a civilian car with special forces dressed as Palestinian refugees who were fleeing from one area to another, with mattresses strapped to the top of the car. And now there's looks like a Namur armored personnel carrier. Another one, and another one. Seems pretty clear to me, unless that's footage from some other location at another time, which it doesn't appear to be. So what has happened since then is that the World Food Program, which is directed by Cindy McCain, widow of late neocon warmonger John McCain, and mother of Zionist fanatic genocidal cheerleader Meghan McCain, has declared that the U.S. aid pier is actually now a military target or a military base, de facto base, and that they will no longer be able to bring food in through the Biden aid pier because of the threat to their workers, to aid workers, just because Israel used aid as a Trojan horse, as they've done again and again and again. Remember, there was an assassination late last year in Jenin inside a hospital where Israelis dressed as hospital workers and doctors and nurses to kill a man in his bed. This is something they've done consistently. They have an entire unit within the special forces called Mistaravim, where they're Mizrahi Israelis who are of Arab descent. They're Arab Jews, and they dress up as Palestinians. They put on kufiya, and they use them for assassinations, to sneak into areas to assassinate people. And also when there are Palestinian protests in the West Bank, they enter and create havoc within the protest, or create a pretext for crushing the protest because one of them will wave a gun. And then that will allow Israeli soldiers in uniforms to fire on the protesters. Something that's been well documented. So this will increase famine inside the Gaza Strip. USAID put out a bulletin on May 31st declaring that it is almost certain that there is famine in northern and southern Gaza. Now the U.S. is basically suspending aid deliveries there and resorting to those pointless aid drops from the air. And this is on Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken, who authorized this operation. I mean, this is just it's such a failure and a catastrophe on so many levels. And Aaron, have you seen any coverage of the U.S. involvement, critical coverage in legacy U.S. media? Because when I was looking at the New York Times on how this unfolded, they had an article by Ronen Bergman, who is an Israeli security reporter, only quoting official Israeli sources. And he said the Israelis snuck into Nuseirat camp. He didn't say how. I assume that may be because he, as an Israeli who also writes for Israeli media, has to answer to the military censor. So the New York Times is answering de facto to the Israeli military censor, but they're not addressing the most scandalous aspect of this massacre and what I would consider a botched rescue operation.
That's incredible. I didn't know that. So the New York Times withheld the fact that they dressed up as aid workers to carry out this massacre. So
we don't know if they withheld it or chose not to report it or why.
Well, they didn't report it. If we know that, then they know it too. So why aren't they telling their audience that? I mean, that's anyway, but that's par for the course for them. Yeah, no, I haven't seen critical coverage. If anything, people are talking about what a success this is. There's a little bit on the Sunday morning news shows, for example, there's a little bit of discomfort with the fact that so many civilians were killed. But the fundamental premise of Israel's right to go out and carry out these massacres, if it can extract 4 hostages, that's not questioned. And meanwhile, all these people saying all this, how Israel has a right to do this, to get its hostages because Hamas took them. And if the people of Gaza don't want to be killed, then they should release all the hostages. That's the logic of October 7th. Because October 7th also was a hostage rescue operation. The aim was to get captives to free Palestinian hostages who are held by the thousands in Israeli dungeons. Although I'm not drawing an equivalence because Palestinians actually have an argument for that operation because they're the ones being occupied. And they've actually tried peaceful means before, which have all failed. And so their military operation on October 7th was a desperate effort to get their own people released, among other goals, including having their basic rights respected. So I'm not drawing an equivalence because there is none. Palestinians actually have a case for carrying out attacks like that. Israel doesn't. It's an occupying power. If it wanted its hostages back, it can enter into negotiations, and there have been multiple opportunities for that. We know that even before a single Israeli soldier went into Gaza, Hamas offered to free all of the captives if Israel agreed not to invade. Israel rejected that. There have been more overtures since then. They've rescued now a total of, I think, 7 Israeli captives, but 100 have been freed through negotiations. So that's a massive disparity in terms of like which strategy works more, negotiation or rescue efforts. And meanwhile, how many of their own captives have they killed in strikes? One of the captives who was freed, Noah Aragam, said she almost died in an Israeli airstrike. She was very lucky to actually still be alive.
Yep. Two of those who were with her were killed, as I said before, in Israeli airstrikes. It appears that over 40 captives in Gaza have been killed by the Israelis. These are Israeli citizens killed by the Israelis. And consistently, what they say again and again, including one of the former hostages who came out with Argamani says, is that the thing that they frightened them the most was the Israeli airstrikes. They faced very little threat from being killed because they were so valuable to Hamas. Let's look at an image that I think illustrates the disparity in treatment between Israeli captives and Palestinian captives of Israel. Israel currently holds over 3,400 Palestinians in administrative detention, meaning they have been jailed without charges. Well, this is Noah Argamani after coming out doing it looks like she's doing product placement for Coca-Cola or something with her father. She looks pretty healthy. She looks like she's been eating okay. Her eyebrows are really, I don't know, did she get a chance to do her brows before, after captivity? I don't know. But
an Israeli anchor was actually fired for making that same point. The Israeli anchor on TV said that her eyebrows look better than mine, and so she was fired for saying that.
She seems to have been treated well. She actually described in her hostage video, when she was talking about facing airstrikes, how her Qassam guards or captors were actually placing mattresses around her to protect her and her fellow hostages from the airstrikes, just because their lives were so valuable as political leverage. And then here are Palestinian men emerging from the Sde Teman concentration camp in south of Beersheba in the Negev desert in Israel. They have been tortured, and they basically get dropped off on the border of Gaza and are told to march a kilometer or two until they're picked up. And they all come back with horrific wounds. There's a leaked UN report, which was buried at the end of a New York Times article about this camp. Some New York Times reporters actually got access to the camp. I don't know why they buried this. Well, I do know why they buried it. Multiple Palestinian men describing being forced to sit on burning batons, to be sodomized with batons. One man was killed as the result of being sodomized by Israeli concentration camp guards with a baton. And that's buried at the end of a New York Times article. Meanwhile, we'll cover this later if we have time. The bogus rape, sexual assault allegations about mass rape on October 7th were the subject of a front page New York Times feature, which has now been completely discredited and debunked. The co-author has been fired. It's the source of internal rancor. And someone I know actually was tortured, has been tortured in an Israeli prison. Someone who has no connection to Hamas or any militancy. He's a heroic figure, someone who's defended his village of Nabi Salah for over a decade with no weapons at all. And that's why.
Let me show the.
Well, I have.
Let me show the before and after. Yeah. Okay.
Here's the before and after. This is Bassem Tamimi before, being thrown in a dungeon for 8 months without charges. And this is Bassem Tamimi after, that he emerged earlier today from an Israeli concentration camp known as Ofer prison in the occupied West Bank. And yeah, I've known Bassem. He's a brilliant person. He's a heroic person who helped kind of conceive and popularize the idea of unarmed resistance against settlers and the army. I've been to his village many times. This is me and him in Oslo. You can see he looks pretty healthy there. And now he looks like someone who emerged from a concentration camp. Meanwhile, the hostages emerging from Gaza all look fairly normal.
Here's a before and after for Noah Argaman this is from Tara Alami. She points out, look at the before and after. It's like, you wouldn't notice a difference, and compare that to Bassem Tamimi and all the other prisoners. I mean, and again, those prisoners who even make it out alive from Israeli dungeons. Think about the doctor from Al Shifa Hospital who was kidnapped and didn't make it out alive. He died in prison. So even those Palestinians who are freed are lucky to come out with their lives. And, as we saw from the previous picture, he looked unrecognizable from how he was before.
Yeah.
Hair turned gray.
I mean, he looks like he's lost something like 80 pounds. By the way, Bassem was nearly killed after being tortured in an Israeli prison when he was arrested during the first Intifada. He was dropped from a ceiling by Israeli torturers and was in a coma for several months. I learned this through interviewing him, members of his family. It's not something questioned by the Israelis. So he's familiar with their torture dungeons. And his daughter, Ahed, who was jailed for a long period by the Israelis when she was younger for slapping an Israeli soldier after the soldier shot her cousin in the head with a rubber bullet. Me and Anya Parampil got to interview her cousin. His head was like flattened. He lived. He was miraculously saved, but for the rest of his life, he has like the path of a rubber bullet cutting through his skull. So she slapped a soldier, was jailed in a dungeon. She was jailed again after October 7th because they're considered sort of resistance figures in the West Bank. And I haven't heard anything from her, and I've heard she's extremely traumatized. I don't know what the situation is, but we haven't heard much from her. And then here we have an Israeli former hostage who was released during the early December captive hostage swap. Her name is Agam Goldstein Almog. She was freed in the November truce. And Israelis are basically telling her it's too bad you returned. And she's been met with a wave of hatred by Israelis. Where can one find the space within the laws to deal with such horrific comments from people who live on this earth with me? Like, too bad you returned, or you had it easy in captivity. She said this at a public event. And the reason that they hate her so much and she's getting so much hate mail, she described her relation with her captors. But those are my captors, my food, my water, my life, and my death. People just can't grasp it. So she basically said that they didn't sexually assault her, that they didn't brutally abuse her. And that's how she's treated. Kind of reminds me of how Israeli society treated, and I'm not comparing what happened there to the Holocaust, but just in terms of the collective psychosis, Holocaust survivors from the displaced persons camp, when they entered Israeli society in the 1950s, they were called being marginalized. They were called sabon, which means soap. They were basically hated because they were considered weak, while the Zionists are standing up for themselves. They, according to Zionist mythology, went like sheep to the slaughter. And they were not really welcomed into society until the Eichmann trial in 1963, in which Ben-Gurion made a concerted decision to make the Holocaust a major part of Israeli life, which was in order to justify Israel's brutalization of the Palestinians as necessary in order to prevent another one. So it's so many layers of sickness here. Now Tony Blinken is following this massacre by arriving to try to shepherd through a ceasefire deal. But it's unclear, Aaron, whose deal the U.S. is pushing. It looks like they're pushing the Israeli deal, or the Israeli proposal. They're pushing the Israeli proposal, but it doesn't even look like the Israelis agree to their own proposal.
Well, the actual, like, the best Israel is willing to entertain is the same thing as always: a 6-week pause followed by a resumption of the massacre whenever they want, in which they get all of their captives back, which then reduces Hamas's leverage to zero. That's the Israeli offer, to the extent that there is one. And Blinken is going around the world pretending as if Israel's accepted what Biden laid out, which did not have those conditions of just 6 weeks. Biden pretended as if Israel has accepted a far-reaching permanent ceasefire that in reality Israel has not, to the point where, like, Israel is insisting, even if a UN resolution were to come up, like, the Biden administration put forward a UN resolution that they said was Israel's proposal, and then Israel actually rejected it, partly because it mentioned the word ceasefire, whereas Israel only wants it to be called a cessation of hostilities, because ceasefire to them implies something permanent, which they don't want to commit to. They want to be able to massacre at will. So therefore, Blinken's job right now is to go around pretending as if Israel is putting forward a proposal that in real life they've actually rejected.
It looks like he's just saying they're putting forward a proposal the same way the U.S. always said Israel wants peace. Israel wants a two-state solution. It's on the Palestinians to accept this. And then when the Palestinians walk away, because it's not an actual proposal for a Palestinian state, it's a proposal for the Palestinians to end resistance to occupation in exchange for a collection of cantons that are walled in. Then they point to the Palestinians and say, hey, they're rejectionists. They walked away from the most generous offer. And we hear that same language now with Tony Blinken, a generous offer, a generous deal. Here's someone who was in the Clinton administration when they were doing this, when this whole charade was concocted. And again, it's unclear whether the Israelis even agree to this proposal, which Blinken says is theirs. Here's a very telling exchange at the from the State Department last week between Sam Husseini and Blinken spokesman Matthew Miller, in which Husseini asks, will the Israelis accept the proposal that you say is theirs?
It is not Israel that is the roadblock to a ceasefire right now. It is not Israel that is a roadblock to hostages being returned. 600 trucks a day of humanitarian assistance coming in. Palestinians being able to safely return to their neighborhoods and eventually get to the reconstruction of Gaza. It is Hamas. All that is on the table in a proposal that is sitting with Hamas, as it has been sitting with Hamas for 6 days now. We await their answer.
Did Israel accept the proposal?
Go ahead.
Can I follow up on the Hamas thing?
You just said it's with Hamas.
Please don't interrupt. Sam, we've had this conversation before. Please don't interrupt me. Please don't interrupt your colleagues.
I'm not interrupting her.
Thank you.
I'm asking for clarification.
Can I just follow up with my question?
So Israel
please?
accepted?
I think you are
Okay.
interrupting her.
All right.
Nadia, go ahead.
Thank you. Actually, a spokesman for Hamas.
Unbelievable. And that Saudi correspondent like boxes Sam out. It kind of collaborates with Miller to prevent Sam from asking the follow-up on whether Israel has accepted the proposal. But he could just say yes. He could just say yes and say, okay, so yes, moving on. But he can't say yes because Israel has rejected the last 2 proposals that Hamas has said they look favorably upon. It didn't work. Hamas called their bluff.
There's also a very telling line in there where he talks about all the things that Hamas could get if it just bowed to Israeli demands. One of the things he says is 600 aid trucks per day could be coming in if Hamas.
Wow.
So, but wait, he's admitting there though that Israel is deliberately blocking all these aid trucks from coming in to get what it wants, which is collective punishment, which is a war crime. They openly admit out loud that they're using aid trucks as leverage against Hamas. And that means you're deliberately depriving hundreds of thousands of people of life-saving assistance just to impose your demands on Hamas that they accept your pause to a mass murder. It's an outright admission. I mean, like, because why are the movement of aid trucks conditional on anything that Hamas does in terms of the release of the hostages? Either you believe in the international norm of not blocking aid or you don't. And obviously the US government and its Israeli ally believe fully in a starvation siege if it can achieve their political aims, which is a form of terrorism.
Yeah, I mean, prior to October 7th, over 1,500 trucks were going in a day. Now it's what, 600 is a great offer, along with that not a permanent ceasefire. I mean, that's the real crux of the biscuit here is there's no permanent ceasefire that the U.S. is putting on the table. That's what Hamas is demanding. They're calling for a 6-week pause. It's unclear whether Israel will even honor that. And then they continue attacking again with Hamas abandoning all its leverage. It doesn't seem like a deal that can be accepted. And so what's Blinken doing in the region? It looks like he's just buying Israel more time. Then you have the issue of the Israeli coalition collapsing, or the war cabinet collapsing, because Benny Gantz, who's supposed to be the centrist, former Israeli army chief of staff who oversaw the 2014 assault on Gaza, which was sort of a trial run for this genocide, has bolted the war cabinet, along with Gabi Ashkenazi, other former chief of staff, the butcher of Gaza from 2008, 2009. These are 2 figures who are much more accountable to the Americans. Netanyahu has said Benny Gantz is basically being controlled by Biden. But where does it leave the war cabinet? It leaves it with, it's just a collection of fanatics. And Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Kahanist maniac, arsonist, is demanding to replace Benny Gantz in the war cabinet. So who is on the Israeli side to negotiate with at this point? That's completely unclear. But what Blinken is doing there, I think there's nothing he can get done except maybe at best a swap for just like a few hostages. The easy thing to do would just be to end the damn war. One phone call. I've been saying this for months and months and months. One phone call and you can get all these former Israeli hostages on the White House lawn at a big ceremony with Tony Blinken and Biden, looking like heroes, but they can't do that because Netanyahu stands in the way. They don't want to end the war. And Biden's donors stand in the way, along with Trump donors. AIPAC stands in the way. So don't expect anything from this except buying time for genocide. Is the DNC going to happen, Aaron?
The DNC is going to happen, but
I mean, in real life.
in real life, I mean, they're trying to hold as much of it virtually as possible. And just to make sure that they stigmatize the protests that will be there as much as possible. Now they're starting to roll out the Russiagate playbook.
Oh yeah,
for that. Because why not? Of course, the whole template of the Russiagate playbook, in part, is basically any failure of DNC elites is the fault of Russia, and any scrutiny of their policies there must be Russia's doing. So now they're saying there's been a whole series of media pieces about this in the usual places like MSNBC that basically Russia is going to manipulate protesters to get them to protest Biden in Chicago at the DNC. So protesters will be out there not because they don't like mass murder and blind support for an apartheid regime, but because Russia is manipulating them through its dark arts of social media bots. By the way, and it's great timing for this because just as this fear-mongering campaign is coming out, what did we just learn from a very rare piece of journalism in the New York Times? That Israel spent millions of dollars on an influence campaign, including using social media bots to try to sway public opinion in its favor after October 7th. And have we seen any of the Russiagators like Rachel Maddow who cried on TV when some Russian troll farm workers were indicted for putting up some silly memes that nobody saw and that were barely about the election? Has Rachel Maddow voiced any outrage at Israel being caught spending a lot of money, far more than any Russian troll farm workers ever spent, to try to manipulate U.S. voters to support mass murder? Of course not. Of course not, because that's the right type of foreign influence that is welcomed with open arms.
This is the Chicago Sun-Times. Russian propaganda push expected in Chicago for Democratic National Convention, experts say. And then the expert happens to be Max Bergman of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. This is just a target-rich stew for the Russians to try lots of things and see what works. Right. Well, so the experts are just basically frontmen for the three-letter agencies that are freaking out. And they're just trying to discredit protesters as though they're controlled by gamma rays from Putin's brain, as though they're not genuinely mad. I mean, once they stop being hypnotized by Putin, you know, it would be terrifying is if they found out Israel was committing genocide. That might make them really mad. But this is just desperate. And yeah, that New York Times piece that you mentioned, Aaron, I'm glad they reported that on a multi-million-dollar Israeli influence operation using online trolls. But that's just kind of like a limited hangout to me. I mean, the Israelis are just using AIPAC to dump untold millions into U.S. politics. That's meddling. I mean, the meddling's happening right in front of our faces. It's just considered business as usual. And well, we'll talk about that a little more later. But I mean, look at what they're doing to us. Look at what they're doing to us. The Washington Post has run one of the most malicious smear pieces ever on us in order to claim without or suggest without any evidence that the Grayzone is sponsored by and controlled by Iran and Russia, and that we are pumping out misinformation on behalf of these foreign entities. Doesn't contain any proof of that in the article. It doesn't contain anything even like circumstantial evidence. It doesn't even prove that we pumped out any misinformation. What it does is muddy the waters by design, relying entirely on quote unquote experts who all are fronts for US intelligence, like literally almost all of them. And it's, I mean, first of all, a compliment in a way. It shows that we're doing a good job. I mean, it shows that especially our reporting since October 7th, has really broken through and made an impact. And it's not only the Israel lobby freaking out, but the U.S. national security state is freaking out. This is the headline, bizarre headline that readers of the Washington Post were met with. News site editors' ties to Russia, Iran show misinformation's complexity. Experts say an overlap in funding underscores concern that the spread of falsehoods and propaganda online is entering a more complicated stage as the November election draws closer. What does anything we do have to do with the November election? Where is the overlap in funding? Where are the falsehoods? Where's the propaganda? None of this is explained in the article. And then readers are met with an image of Vladimir Putin, which says that Russia has sought new ways to reach Americans through news sites and social media. But it doesn't really demonstrate any Russian role in the gray zone.
This
Basically,
article,
go ahead.
This article does show misinformation's complexity, as the headline says, because it's a very elaborate and confusing way to fool people into thinking that we're funded by Russia and Iran. That's what this Washington Post article was trying to do. And it worked because other people picked it up, even though, of course, we're not funded by Russia and Iran, or we have no ties to any state. This article went out of its way to disingenuously suggest that, and other people picked it up and claimed that this article said exactly what it didn't say, because there's, of course, it had no evidence to offer because there is none. And it was so malicious that the reporter, the way he framed his story, was an outright lie that he actually had to correct, or at least he had to correct it in the story. He didn't correct it on Twitter, but this is him. His name is Joseph Men. He's a so-called disinformation reporter at the Washington Post. And this is what he wrote. I wrote about a news site whose top leaders have taken money from Iran as well as Russia, showing how it's getting harder to trace the forces behind any one false narrative. Well, in this case, it was very easy to trace the force behind a false narrative because this guy, Joseph Mann, was the one putting it out. And he had to correct his article, which initially said that top leaders of the Grayzone have taken money from Iran and Russia. They had to correct that because it was a complete lie. All they did was take the fact that Wyatt Reed, who's a deputy editor at the Grayzone, has done work before for Iran's Press TV and Sputnik. And this was before he joined the Grayzone. And he spun that
Years
through
before.
disingenuous language, years before. And Wyatt Reed did this work out in the open. It's not as if this was hidden. And Joseph Mann took that as if he had made some shocking discovery. And he spun that into a conspiracy theory or an outright lie that we take money from Iran and Russia. And many people bought it. This was for some people who have been desperate to take down the Grayzone because they don't want to go through the normal adult thing of just challenging us on the merits, on trying to refute our arguments and our journalism. They seized on this as finally proof, even though he had to correct this moronic claim that he made right here. But of course, by the time he did in his article, he didn't even correct it on Twitter. That's how dishonest he is. The tweet promoting his article was false, and he still has not deleted it or corrected it. And he's a so-called disinformation reporter.
Yeah. How do you keep that online? I mean, we'll show the correction. When they've corrected it at the top of the article, they basically retracted one of the major claims of the article. A previous version of this article incorrectly said leaders of the online news site Grayzone had received payments from Iranian media, according to recently unearthed documents. The documents show that only one of the site's editor received such payments. That article has been corrected. Actually, it didn't say leaders have taken it from Iranian media. It says from the Iranian government, as though Wyatt were being paid for some favors under the table, as if he hadn't been publicly doing work openly and promoting his work for Press TV, which hundreds and hundreds of Americans have appeared on and done, contributions for. They're making it seem like it was some secret under the table thing. Then they use this word overlap as though there's an overlap with the Grayzone when he was doing it. He was appearing on Press TV years before the Grayzone. He was on the Grayzone. And then, think of all the people that have appeared on there or on RT or Sputnik they're not being singled out. Wyatt's being singled out because he works with us now. He's completely independent. He's not taking any foreign money, and he's doing severe structural damage to the U.S.-Israeli propaganda complex. And that's why he's being singled out. Joseph Menn has yet to correct this tweet. He just has a tweet up that's just a straight up lie. And the Washington Post doesn't care.
And even this correction is false because it does not properly characterize its own mistake. The error, the falsehood was not just that Grayzone leaders have taken money from Iranian media. They also said Russian and Iranian media. They didn't correct the Russia part. And again, the correction does not make clear that these payments are not concurrent. So whatever work Wyatt did, it was before he joined the Grayzone. They're still creating the false impression that Wyatt is being paid by the Iranian government while still working at the Grayzone, which is just a straight up lie. So that's how desperate they are to try to smear us. And, I had an exchange with Joseph Menn, which led to this correction. And he basically, it took him forever to answer my simple question. Basically, my question was, Joseph, you said that top leaders of the Grayzone have taken money from Russian and Iranian government outlets, but your article only concerns one person, because they're based on these hacked documents that showed Wyatt being paid for the work that he was publicly doing. So who are these top leaders? Give me one more name. And it took him forever to answer. And finally, I just got back. He said, I don't mind revealing this because I don't respect this guy at all. So I don't feel bound. And by the way, and actually I never said it was off the record. So he just said, we are discussing. So that was an admission that actually he had no other names in mind. He just concocted a straight up lie. And eventually I never heard back beyond that. And then the correction appeared. But even the correction was still incomplete and false because they didn't correct the Russia part. And how much time did this waste for both of us, Max? Like, it took up a lot of time for me. I know it took up a lot of time for you because you had to write a rebuttal. We've had to consult with people to see what our options are. So the point of this is not just, I think, to smear us. It's also to waste our time. And rather than go out and just do the work we want to do, we have to spend time defending ourselves, as this happens so many times. I've lost track of how many times we've had to respond to smears like this. There was the previous Washington Post article from, what's her name, Lizzie Dwoskin.
Liza Dwoskin, yeah. That was also very revealing.
She was the one who claimed that basically Palestinians weren't a real people. They were just a collection of desert Bedouins. There was the whole thing in The Guardian where The Guardian funded a Pierre Omidyar / State Department study that said I'm the most prolific spreader of disinformation on Syria, even though they couldn't name a single example of my alleged disinformation. There's been so many of these things. And if the aim is not just to smear us, but to waste our time, certainly the smearing, I think, always fails because they have to issue corrections because they always print lies. But the wasting our time, absolute success there for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it is a waste of it. It does, waste time and prevent us from exposing the very thing that they are trying to destroy us for, like from doing what they hate us for. That's true. But this was a real escalation, as Mark Ames pointed out. It was kind of like a Steele dossier, like a dodgy dossier, where they're just trying to get something into the Washington Post. And when I say they, I mean the three-letter agencies that operate behind institutions like the Atlantic Council or ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which were cited in this piece, in order to spur some kind of like federal criminal investigation and to basically criminalize independent journalism on the basis of innuendo and just straight up lies. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to do like what they did to Carter Page, where they got a FISA warrant on Carter Page thanks to the Steele dossier, which has been discredited from top to bottom. So it is important to respond. And I don't know if we're done responding right now. You have in this article, as I said, the Atlantic Council is quoted, and it's just it's just bogus. Let's pull up that quote here. This is from Emerson Brooking, co-director of Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. What you are reporting is, I think, the most practical example of that convergence we've seen, where you have someone who has deep ties to Iranian state media working for an organization that we also know as a destination for narrative laundering from Russia. Okay, first of all, everything he said is a lie. Wyatt Reed does not have deep ties to Iranian state media. He did all they know, which is the fact. I mean, all they know based on these so-called unearthed documents is what Wyatt has already made public, which is that he appeared on Press TV and did production work or production for them or something. I mean, it's basically like a handful of appearances in 2021, and they're saying deep ties, like he's some major mover and shaker in Tehran media connected to the IRGC somehow. So that's just completely ridiculous. And then we are a destination for narrative laundering from Russia. Like Russians are telling us what to say on the daily. Like we have contacts with Russian officials or Russian intelligence to help us launder narratives. He has no evidence of that. That's not the case. And that's the Atlantic Council Digital Forensic Research Lab. What is that? That is something that is sponsored by the US government, US state money that does narrative laundering for US intelligence, because the CIA and all the, DHS can't just come out and say, hey, we're attacking US citizens. We're accusing US citizens of disinformation and misinformation and malinformation. So they get the Atlantic Council and Emerson Brooking to do it for them, which is a form of disinformation. They are sponsored by foreign governments from Saudi Arabia. They are sponsored by Atlantic Council has taken $250,000 from Burisma at a time when Hunter Biden was on the board of Burisma, when Joe Biden was receiving honors and being courted as vice president by the Atlantic Council. I mean, this is one of the most corrupt state-sponsored narrative laundering organizations in town, and they're attacking us.
Well, and that's what I love about this article is it's entirely projection. They accuse us of narrative laundering. They're laundering a narrative, trying to smear independent journalists who expose Western state crimes. They accuse us of spreading disinformation. They're the ones who had to add a major correction to their story because they spread disinformation. They accuse us of being state-tied. They're the ones who are using state-funded sources to advance their narrative and concealing from their audience that these are state-funded entities. So they're talking about the complexity and how hard it is to trace what states are behind what. They're participating in what they claim to be criticizing because they conceal from their audience that their sources are all state-tied. So Atlantic Council, which you mentioned, and also ASPI, this Australian think tank, it is also funded by NATO states and weapons manufacturers and the usual suspects. So it's all entirely projection. And it's a really important point that you raised before. This is a new level of journalism, because it's like they're trying to get Wyatt prosecuted and they're trying to get us investigated. That's obvious. And there have been people calling for investigations as a result of Joseph Men's falsehoods. Joseph Men asked Wyatt to speak to his lawyers, basically trying to get him in trouble with the law. I've never heard of journalism like this before, especially directed at other journalists.
This is Eli Kohanim, who is a former deputy director of the Anti-Semitism Commission under Mike Pompeo's State Department, someone who spread lies for a living on behalf of Israel, declaring Max Blumenthal now documented to be on Islamic Republic of Iran's payroll, a security threat. He and the Grayzone news should be investigated. That's just complete false. It's a falsehood. It's a complete falsehood. It's aggressive libel by a former U.S. government official. And that's the point of what the Washington Post was trying to do. And we have, we also had, well, here's something you can do if you're at home watching and you're not happy about the Washington Post, purchased by one of the richest men in the world, one of the 3 richest men in the world, who just days later then inked a contract with the CIA for $600 million at Amazon to host its cloud. If you're not happy about them trying to get American journalists that you support, that you fund independent American journalists jailed for their journalism. Send a letter to the Washington Post. letters@washpost.com. Send a letter to Joseph Men, joseph.men@washpost.com. He puts his email on his Twitter account, so I'm not doxing joseph.men@washpost.com. Tell him you support the Grayzone. Tell him the Grayzone is supported by people like you, not by Iran or Russia, and that they're trying to deprive you of voice, just like they tried to do during Russiagate, just like they tried to do day after day. Tell them how you really feel about this kind of repugnant journalism on behalf of the CIA and the FBI and all the three-letter agencies when they never tell real stories about how we're being screwed out of $95 billion to sponsor permanent wars and genocide. Tell them how you feel about them targeting someone who, with prison for doing some appearances on a foreign network when he was starting out his journalism career. Is this the person that they should target with prison? What has Jeff Bezos done? Are his hands clean? We got Wyatt Reed with us. Wyatt, you ready? Give me a thumbs up. Wyatt, what's your response to this smear piece targeting you, basically calling for you to be jailed?
Well, it took me a while, I think, to kind of wrap my head around it. First, because it's a little bit bizarre to kind of see yourself as like, I don't consider myself to be some kind of guy that's trying to put my face all over everything. I consider myself to be a journalist. I like to kind of publish my articles, and that's mainly what I do, right? So it was a little bit disconcerting, I think, jarring, just on a first person level. Like, it took me, I think, a few days to really understand what was going on exactly. And that, first of all, the lies were the point, right? They have to have known that the very first sentence of this outrageous hit piece was a lie. They knew that when they published it. That's why, they knew. Absolutely. And if they didn't, I think that speaks volumes to just the absolute lack of, journalistic competence that's going on over there. But I'm almost positive, they knew what they were doing. The whole point here was to insinuate. It's an article full of insinuations and innuendos. An entire timeline is basically massaged into existence that never truly happened. They correctly note that I contributed a handful of articles to the Grayzone in 2019 and 2020. And they correctly note that I joined as the editor in 2023, but they repeatedly referred to what they called overlapping sources of funding. There was no overlap. Any journalism that I did for anyone other than the Grayzone, that took place when I was not working for the Grayzone. And that's a very important fact, that anybody who truly intends to put the truth forward, anyone who's actually trying to do real journalism would focus on that fact, would mention that even though we're trying to allege some kind of pattern and overlap here, we don't actually have any evidence to back up that took place. That's not what happened here. Instead, they deliberately twist and exaggerate every little potential bit of truth, intentionally overlook any kind of mitigating information and refuse to include it. Nobody mentions, that I, in the same period of time, I'm getting paid by outlets like CBS News, right? That's not mentioned. Of course, any other outlet that I received funding from, Mint Press News or anyone else, those aren't mentioned. Any other independent outlets, I should say. So it's I want to say, like, I'm surprised that they're willing to go to this level, that they're willing to say, hey, this guy appeared on Press TV a handful of dozens of times 4 years ago. Let's see if that was a sanctions violation and maybe throw him in jail. And at the time when I was appearing on Press TV, I had this kind of question in the back of my head. I knew a number of people who were doing the same. And I asked them, do you have any concerns at all that the government might not like what you're doing? And everyone told me, no, this is it's journalism. This is First Amendment protected speech. This is absolutely normal activity. It's been done by dozens of people, and you know, no one would ever get in trouble for doing journalism for the wrong outlet. But here we are. It's a few years later. It's 2024. Things only seem to be going in one direction, and that's criminalization of dissenting opinion and thought. And I think this right here is basically a prime example of it. It's not just at the Julian Assange level now. You know, they're just going after basically anyone who they can use to try to create a narrative where none exists, to create nefarious links where none exist, in order to disparage and dismiss all of us who do not support the status quo in this country.
Yeah, I mean, we had Kit Clarenberg getting hauled off a flight, returning to London, and detained by counter-terror police for his journalism. The case is still open, but he is, you know, was let go, able to leave the country. They seized his devices, and the UK proceeded to pass a National Security Act, which essentially criminalizes journalism that contains leaks that they do not approve of. But if the hacked documents are coming from the other direction, well, that's just fine. If they are unearthed documents exposing Wyatt Reed doing something he publicly said he did, well, that's just fine. But you can be jailed now in the UK. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. You can be jailed now in the UK for publishing leaked or hacked documents that exposes UK national security secrets, classified documents. And that means you can be jailed simply for journalism. Kind of trying to get around, circumvent what I think Obama himself called the New York Times rule, or the New York Times effect, which was what was making it so hard for the Obama administration to prosecute Julian Assange, which is that the New York Times was publishing these documents that WikiLeaks was gathering under and you know, operating fully under the First Amendment and under traditional journalistic ethics. So they're really trying to limit that. Why? Because our ruling elite is frightened. They're getting desperate. People are moving away from mainstream media precisely because of what the Washington Post is doing. I mean, who the hell is actually going to read this article that was put in the print edition, a full page in the Washington Post? It's almost impossible to decipher what's going on there unless you already know who we are and you hate us. And then obviously no one could read it who hates us, because they either deliberately or, well, they all misinterpreted it.
Well, I will say it's interesting to me that Joseph Menn and the Washington Post apparently felt this article and this information was so groundbreaking and important to get out there that they actually specifically removed the paywall from this website to allow everyone to be able to see that I've been exposed for appearing on an outlet that I openly talked about appearing on, retweeted my appearances on at the time, half a dozen times on social media. I even labeled myself correspondent at Press TV on Twitter. Not exactly the most earth-shattering revelations there, but again, you know, I don't think that was really the point. The point was to say, here's somebody who's been vaguely in the vicinity of Iranian media. That, you know, my handful of appearances were used by the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensics Research Lab to declare that I had quote unquote deep ties to Iranian media. As though I had spent years in Tehran, like micromanaging the outlet. But again, you know, I don't know. I think the point was basically to put something out here that it didn't matter whether it stood up to scrutiny. It doesn't matter whether it's factually correct or not. It can just be cited and used on our Wikipedia page and used by NAFO trolls anytime they engage with anybody who cites us on social media. Say, oh, you know, those guys who are directly funded by the Ayatollah, is that who you're depending on? And to your point, Max, about the National Security Act in the UK, what's super draconian about that to me is under the language that they use, and I'll quote from the exact document here, quote, "It is immaterial whether a person is aware that activity in which they are or have been engaged is hostile activity, or whether a state for or on behalf of which, or in the interests of which a hostile act or is carried out or has instigated, is otherwise or has instigated, sanctioned, or is otherwise aware of the carrying out of the act." So it's immaterial whether a person charged under this act was aware that they were carrying out any particular crime in the first place. So that's the incredibly twisted kind of Orwellian logic that we're dealing with, where you could conceivably break the law. You don't know you have no idea it's against the law. It might not even be against the law, but you can just as easily be charged and tied up in court for years and years under it, regardless.
And look at the kind of echo chamber it's created of just straight up malicious lies. This is a headline from I-24, an Israeli news site. It says, operating in the gray zone, the pro-Hamas outlet being funded by Iran and Russia. So Joseph Mann puts out a claim that, as you said, Wyatt, he knows it's false. Other people run with it, take that as like corroborating information because the Washington Post printed it. And the fact that the Washington Post printed a correction and the fact that the Washington Post was disingenuous all the way through doesn't matter. This outlet takes it and spins it into something that the Washington Post didn't even say, because that's just how it works with these people. They have no concern at all for the facts. And this was one of the intents. But why, like, let me ask you,
sorry to cut in, Aaron, but then that article was put out as calls to investigate the gray zone from the U.S. And the calls were put out by Rabbi Shmuley. That's who was quoted in that article.
Yeah.
So great expert there, walking anti-Semitic stereotype and dildo salesman, Rabbi Shmuley. Anyway, the headline is totally false.
Yeah.
But why? Let me ask you, if you don't mind answering this, like, what would you say to someone who would ask you, well, why were you working for Iranian state media? Why don't you go do this journalism for, our free American press? Like, for example, like, why couldn't you do the kind of work you were doing in the Washington Post rather than working for a state outlet?
So the answer to why anybody would work for Press TV or Sputnik or RT or any of these outlets that have now been totally demonized in the American imagination, but until a decade ago were actually considered very legitimate. The reason that any journalist would work for these is because journalists generally aren't able to do their work for free. You need somebody at the end of the day, unless you're doing it as a side gig, to be able to pay you to do that so you can pay your own bills. And this is, of course, partly a legacy of the fact that the independent media scene in the United States has been so thoroughly corporatized and eroded and basically totally turned inside out to the point where half of the independent outlets that I grew up reading are now more or less indistinguishable from MSNBC. We're in like a media landscape where there are just not that many alternative places for independent journalists to go work that will allow them to print what they genuinely think. And that is the unfortunate reality, whether or not you like the outlet that in particular that is broadcasting my views. That's kind of a separate question. I think the main question should be for viewers, and it certainly should be for Joseph Mann, is what I am saying true? Is the factual content of what I am saying out loud, is that correct or is it not? Is it true or is it false? And, that to me is the most important thing that you can quantify any journalist's expertise or success or credibility by. How frequently do they say true things versus how frequently do they say false things? And personally, I've never written any articles that I've retracted. I stand by everything I've ever written. I stand by everything that I voiced aloud on all of my appearances. I didn't say anything illegal. I didn't say anything wrong. I didn't say anything incorrect. I've certainly said a lot of things that upset plenty of people. And I think that's really the main issue, is that I and you all upset the wrong people. We upset people who have a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of supporters who are willing to engage in deeply unethical and unsavory tactics in order to try to drag our reputations through the mud.
Yeah, and listen, let me just say, the point of my very leading question was to say that our media here in the U.S. is state media. So therefore, if you want to criticize your own government or report critically on your own government, factually, you have to go to other states in many cases, because our own private outlets here generally do not allow people to actually do their jobs, especially when it comes to foreign policy, which is the heart of the hegemonic system that we have. So if you want to do the kind of work you did at Press TV, I know you did critical coverage of Israel and of the US-backed Saudi mass murder in Yemen. You can't do that in the Washington Post. And if you do, you have to jump through a lot of hoops that are pretty much impossible for anyone to attain. So therefore, the opportunities to do that kind of journalism in the US are very rare. And what's funny is when people like us try to do it on our own independently, free of any state tie or corporate tie, then we get smeared for it by our so-called free media. So that's how the enforcement works. And ideally for me, nobody would have to work for any state media outlet, but that's just the reality. And especially even if you're working in the adversarial lefty media space, if you have the kind of views we have where like we don't side with the CIA and we don't buy CIA propaganda, many lefty outlets, I'm sorry to say, as you were talking about, Wyatt, will now ban you for that too. So not only can you not work for corporate media, you also can't go to many lefty independent outlets. So your options are very, very narrow if you actually want to do actual adversarial journalism.
Well, just to clarify, I have never worked for anybody who has demanded that I believe a certain thing, that I say a certain thing, that I report anything in any specific way. If that had happened at any time while I was working for, say, Sputnik, I would have left. And in fact, towards the end of my tenure at Sputnik, things did shift a little bit in a direction not to my liking, and that was a big part of the reason I was interested in leaving. And I will say that in terms of funding independent media, right? So we're being demonized, first of all, for something that's totally false, completely untrue, that somehow Russia and Iran funded the Grayzone directly, just absolute lies, 100% incorrect. But also, what happens when we try to raise our own funds independently on a website like GoFundMe? Well, we're subject to a massive harassment campaign. Our supporters have to go through and we have our funds on our account completely frozen. Our supporters have to email GoFundMe asking, can they have their money back? What's going on with my money? What are you doing with it? And then finally, once that money is returned to them, we have to seek out a legitimate, truly independent fundraising mechanism website, and then have our supporters redonate through that. I mean, you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. The point is not that anyone worked for any particular outlet or believes any particular thing. The point is that we go against the consensus view of the foreign policy establishment, and that we publish things that they don't like. They've been trying to come up with a way for many years to shut us down, and this is just the latest.
And Wyatt, you're debanked on many
That's
platforms.
True. That's true. And if you go to our Wikipedia page, it's reported as though it says that I had problems with PayPal and Venmo. That I reported I had problems with PayPal and Venmo. That's not what happened. And I didn't report it. It's true. If I go on PayPal, if I go on Venmo, I am permanently banned from PayPal and Venmo, which are actually very frequently used, and it's kind of difficult to get around using sometimes. But I am permanently banned without explanation from these websites. The PayPal ban in particular happened within 24 hours of my first ever public post about Paul Mason, this British now wants to be a Labour candidate who's extremely closely linked with British intelligence officers. He very likely had a hand in me being permanently banned from this website. But so that's what we deal with as well. Not for any criminal violation, not for any criminal conduct, but because I said things and believe things that certain people dislike and they disagree with. And instead of having the government shut me down, which would be a First Amendment violation, they just offload that to their friends in big business and big banking, and they have them do it instead, or they hand it to the British intelligence or some foreign intelligence agency to do their dirty work instead. So they keep their hands clean, but manage to tarnish us anyway.
Here's what Zionists are trying to do to Brianna Joy Gray. Hundreds of Zionists have spammed the Bad Faith account, which is her independent podcast, apparently thinking it's Patreon. They're stupid people. These are unintelligent people trying to get me deplatformed from Patreon. Again, a foreign country targeting an American journalist with the goal of making it impossible to earn an income if you criticize Israel. And look at concerns regarding Brianna Joy's platform on Patreon. They're just trying to flood Patreon.
And those are mostly bots. There's no way half of those are real people.
Yeah. Rebecca Rockefeller. Sure, Rebecca Rockefeller. Okay. Lauren. But the point is, the U.S.-Israeli national security state is trying to, behind the facade of liberal democracy, create a new social credit system in which if you effectively criticize them and interfere with their propaganda or political objectives, your social credit plummets and you become basically debanked or cut off from your sources of financial sustenance so that you can no longer survive. That's what they're trying to do. That's what they've tried to do to you, Wyatt, for years. And they're trying to do it to us through the Washington Post, a paper that boldly proclaims that democracy dies in darkness. It's a failing paper that has lost 50% of its readership, according to its publisher, in the past year, whose editor-in-chief, Sally Busby, has just abruptly resigned. The paper is restructuring because actually darkness dies in democracy, and the people are voting with their feet on the Washington Post. Now, I want to just say, before moving on with this discussion, you who are watching, our supporters, created this position at the Grayzone for Wyatt to be with us, to be independent, and that's public. It was never mentioned in the Washington Post for obvious reasons. It was an obvious omission. Propaganda relies on omission of contravening facts. But we're asking you to help demonstrate to the Washington Post that their smear cannot affect us, and to help us continue to build a future for journalists like Wyatt, other people who are doing incredible work for us, like Jeremy Lafredo, also depend on your support. And so we've launched a new fundraiser to defend Wyatt Reed in the Grayzone at Spot Fund. This was the platform we went to after GoFundMe suspended our fundraiser without explanation, obviously under pressure from the same forces that are trying to take us down, and which refused to refund your money for weeks and weeks and weeks. We went to Spot Fund, and they hosted us before. They're doing it again. You can easily find us just by looking up the Grayzone at spotfund.com, and you can support a future for Wyatt Reed and journalists like him, and support independent media, and give a finger to the Washington Post, which will hopefully be represented by an empty office before long. I look forward to urinating on the former offices of the Washington Post. I have no sympathy for them at all. They deserve their own demise. And this is a way of really sticking it to them. So, donate to Wyatt, donate to the Grayzone. We depend on you. We depend on our readers.
We really appreciate people's support. And again, the link will be in the chat of the stream, and also in the episode notes. I wanted to show just one more thing, just to contrast this smear piece with other articles in the Washington Post. So this is from a few years ago. This is the headline from the Post. Bellingcat breaks stories that newsrooms envy, using methods newsrooms avoid. And this is a fawning piece about Bellingcat, which is a state-funded organization that has, among other things, smeared OPCW whistleblowers because they dared to challenge the NATO narrative about chemical weapons attacks by Syria. And these whistleblowers show that in one case in Duma, it was a fraud, and that the OPCW was compromised to advance the US-led narrative of Syrian government guilt. And Bellingcat was a major part of that. And so this article in the Washington Post, fawning over Bellingcat, kissing its feet, does not mention that it's funded by the US and other states, in the US via the National Endowment for Democracy. So they write an article falsely claiming the Grayzone's funded by states, while meanwhile writing puff pieces about actual US state-funded outlets and not mentioning their funding. And this is a part of a pattern in Western corporate media. If you read about Bellingcat, you would not know from anywhere, whether it's the New York Times, the New Yorker, Wired magazine, the Atlantic magazine. They never ever tell you. I can't find one example where they say they admit that Bellingcat is funded by NATO states. There's even one case, it was in a British newspaper, where they said that Bellingcat wisely does not take government funding, which is not true. Bellingcat on its own website quietly admits that it does take government funding. So that's what happens. Actual independent outlets get smeared as being funded by states, whereas actual state-funded outlets that serve Western interests, they get fawning puff pieces in so-called free independent and free corporate media, and the service of not having their state funding disclosed to audiences who otherwise will have no way of knowing unless they read actual independent outlets like the Grayzone.
Yeah. Look at what the Washington Post even says about what you just said. This is crazy. Grayzone does not disclose its financial backing. Little known among most segments of the population, has hundreds of thousands of followers on both YouTube and X, and its stories sometimes ricochet among both the far left and far right. It ricochets. Great writing there. X owner Elon Musk has helped that, corresponding on his platform last year with Grayzone personality. So you're a personality, but they're also referring to leaders. I don't know who's who. Aaron Mate, when Mate accused the investigative website Bellingcat of being a NATO front and said the White House had squelched talk of a negotiated settlement in Ukraine. So he's putting that forward as misinformation when it's obvious that Bellingcat is a Ukraine front, and Ukrainian negotiators themselves have even said that the White House helped squelch talk of a negotiated settlement in Ukraine. And that just throughout this article, accusing us of misinformation for stating facts that might be inconvenient, but which are clearly true. I forgot they cited Clemson University up here, which is another spook front. But yeah, I mean, what you just said, Aaron, is cited as an example of misinformation in the Washington Post.
Well, please print it again, Washington Post. I don't mind spreading more truth if you're going to write about us again. They also mentioned an article that I used to work for Al Jazeera. So basically, I think they're trying to imply that we're also funded by Qatar, maybe there too. They don't mention I've worked for other outlets.
I mean, you're known for working for Democracy Now!
Where is that in the piece? It doesn't, why isn't that mentioned?
Yeah.
But the misinformation, we're peddlers of misinformation. But I mean, look at how he frames everything. Like, at Grayzone, Reed's work includes a March story with Blumenthal attacking celebrity chef Jose Andres for trying to feed Palestinians in Gaza via a jetty made with rubble that the authors said would include genocidal biomatter. And then the article just ends there. I've never seen an article end with the word genocidal biomatter, but hey, we finally got the allegation that Israel's committing genocide into the Washington Post. So I think we deserve credit on that. But they totally misrepresented why we were criticizing Jose Andres for trying to feed Palestinians in Gaza. No, it was they constructed a jetty, which would become the basis for the U.S. aid pier we were talking about earlier, out of the rubble of destroyed homes. People's homes, which they owned in Gaza, were appropriated without their wishes, against their wishes, by some international aid agency to build a jetty that never wound up doing anything. And then Israel proceeded to massacre Jose Andres' staff, even though they were directly coordinating.
There's another line where Joseph Menz says that Israelis complained. I'm quoting him. Israelis complained, quote unquote, about the Grayzone's October 7th reporting, but they don't refute anything that the Grayzone actually said about Israel killing its own people with friendly fire on October 7th, which Israeli media has acknowledged. And apparently you're not allowed to say yet in U.S. corporate media. So basically, Israelis complained that the Grayzone acknowledged what Israeli media also acknowledged too. And that's worth mentioning. Like, some Israelis complained, and therefore Joseph Menz sees that as a knock against the Grayzone because some Israelis complained about a reporting, which he can't actually refute. I mean, this is the level of journalism we're dealing with here.
Well, it just kind of exposes, like, there is no coherent principle underlying. There's no angle that they're really coming at us from specifically. It's every angle. It's, they are insufficiently pro-Israel and insufficiently pro-Palestinian, right? We're trying to stop poor Palestinians from eating from wonderful CIA chef Jose Andres's, bountiful aid pier. And we're also, interfering with the Israeli government's wonderful campaign of total factual information. So it's kind of like it doesn't really matter what we're being accused of. It's just that the bias in this, I think, is very obvious to people who don't really have an axe to grind. Anyone who reads this and doesn't already have a preformed opinion and knows how to read news with a little bit of a skeptical eye, I think it's pretty clear what this piece is attempting to do, exactly why it was written. But for people who just kind of lap up whatever the Washington Post puts out and believe, it's legacy media, they wouldn't let them print it if it wasn't true. Things like this do actually matter to people in my life who've been family members who are reaching out to me wondering, am I some kind of Iranian spy? Many of them are not media literate enough to understand what this piece is and what the point of it and why it's being written and why it has never been written about anyone else who appeared on Press TV. So, from that perspective, it's been kind of a success in terms of handing the people who hate us a weapon to be able to use to try to delegitimize us. It was semi-successful in that sense, just because, they rely on what they rely on to continue their business model, which is that Americans are shockingly poorly informed about a lot of issues.
Yeah, here's another example of why they did this piece. And it's relates to our reporting on October 7th. One such story by Blumenthal devoted thousands of words to allege widespread Israeli attacks against its own citizens on October 7th, while saying that Hamas treated hostages well and used clever tactics. That article by Blumenthal distorted the material from sources it cited. Israelis complained. Israelis complained, and that's the source. Complaining Israelis.
The most self-victimizing nation on earth complained about some factual reporting.
Wait, stop the press.
And we're supposed
Israelis are complaining?
Yeah,
on.
exactly.
Wait.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, if Israelis complained about it, then it must not be true that Israeli media later corroborated my reporting. For example, Ynet, Yediot Aharonot, reporting that Israel enacted a mass Hannibal directive on October 7th, hitting over 70 vehicles, including vehicles with Israeli citizens. Even Haaretz, which has attacked us like 70 times since October 7th, including by reproducing this Washington Post article and referring to us as Greystone. I'm surprised they didn't call us Castle Grayskull. They reported that General Barak Hiram, a top Israeli general, ordered an Israeli tank to shell a home in Kibbutz Be'eri containing over a dozen Israeli captives in order to kill Hamas militants. And they wound up killing 13 Israelis with deliberate orders, knowing they were there. This was the Hannibal directive. I mean, that's what we've been reporting on. We were right. And he's trying to make it seem like we spread misinformation on behalf of Iran and Russia. They're just doing anything they can. And that was the purpose of the first Washington Post smear of us this year by Liza Dovoskin, who refused to tell us live on the phone if she was a Zionist. That article relied on an organization called NCRI, National Contagion Research Institute, which is a front for the ADL and US and Israeli intelligence. And I don't just say that lightly. It's Director Joel Finkelstein was a former director of the ADL, former research director at the Anti-Defamation League. It has been advised by Sima Vaknin-Gil. Look her up. She was the former Israeli intelligence agent who headed Israel's anti-BDS initiative, whose job was to attack and discredit Americans pushing a boycott of Israel. She advised NCRI. And it's just a who's who of spooks. Pro-Israel spooks and ex-DHS spooks and FBI spooks, staff NCRI. And that's who prepared the research for Liza Dvoskin on the first smear of us. So it's obvious why they're going after us. And so you have a chance to support Wyatt and support us against the three-letter agencies, against Israeli intelligence, Israeli spooks who are freaking out right now in this moment because they can't stop us any other way except to try to get us jailed. That's what it's come to. They're like, screw it. We can't stop them. Let's just call for them to all be jailed. Let's Assange them. That's what happened with Julian Assange. They're like, let's just try to finesse some kind of case, some kind of conniving case because we can't stop him. And it's embarrassing for the public to have transparency, for Sunlight to actually penetrate and disinfect the public from this infestation of this secret government of intelligence spooks who are faceless and nameless, who are dictating policy and overseeing a genocide and a seemingly endless, growing proxy war in Ukraine, in which long-range strikes have just been authorized into nuclear power of Russia. The American public is not on board with this. They're not on board with it, but the legacy media outlets like the Washington Post are. So here's your chance at Spot Fund to help us continue to keep Wyatt Reed and other journalists on board and to maintain our independence. I don't know if there's anything else either you want to add, or we can maybe move on.
Nothing
Well,
to add. I will have to go soon though.
I will just say I've noticed a lot of people contributing and sending in just very generous donations, and we very much appreciate it, and we'll be sure to put your money to good use. So I think we can expect a few more Washington Post hit pieces before too long.
Yeah. Forgetting, I mean, you're all Iranian now. You're all IRGC now, because they just don't want the public to have any voice. And if the public does anything that interferes with their objectives, they'll just call you Russian and Iranian. It's like how the BLM protests were run by Russia, according to the Washington Post, and this phony USAID backed initiative called the Alliance for Securing Democracy. It's more like the Alliance for Suppressing Democracy, which we helped expose. But here's another hoax. So thank you all so much for making this possible. You have made this Washington Post hit piece possible, because Wyatt wouldn't be able to be a part of the Grayzone if it wasn't for you, had it not been for you. They tried to stop you from doing that in the first place by suspending the GoFundMe fundraiser. And so we went to Spot Fund. You made this possible, and you made it possible for us to debunk and discredit all of the propaganda constructs that were spun out by Israel after October 7th to generate consent for genocide. That includes the mass rape hoax, which now has been even debunked on the pages of one of the most establishment publications on the planet, Times of London. Breaking. New detailed report from the Times of London admits there is no evidence for the quote-unquote mass rape hoax fabricated and spread by the New York Times, BBC, Guardian, AP, and Reuters, and I would add also Times of London, and notes that Pramila Paten's own UN report confirms this and reiterates her call for an actual UN investigation. So here's the...
I'm sure they credit us right at the top of that article, right?
Yeah, exactly. No, of course not. And if you read the article, like I read it and I said, oh yeah, I debunked that. We debunked that. So it draws on a lot of our research, but obviously it can't credit us because somehow that would discredit the article. I mean, here's one point where like the apocryphal story about the pregnant woman and her fetus, which was also repeated by Michael Herzog, the wife of the Israeli president, is in a still uncorrected Newsweek article. I pointed that out repeatedly, that Newsweek refused to correct that. And then Kohav El-Kayam Levy, the head of this like now kind of discredited Israeli NGO, which was shopping all these allegations about mass rape early on, Also circulated photographs of murdered female soldiers that turned out to be images of Kurdish fighters in Syria. Who put her on blast for that? And she blocked me for it? Well, it was me. So, you know,
No,
it's
that's
great,
really
though.
important because that photograph was not just cited in media; it was on an official Israeli government website, right?
Yeah.
Like purporting to show an Israeli rape victim, when in fact, Max, as you, I believe, were the first person to point out, that was of a Kurdish woman taken in Syria, not even in Israel. So they were using fake images. So that's obviously derived from your work. We're certainly used to not being credited for it, but this is the first time an establishment media outlet, albeit in the UK, I would never see this happening in the US, at least not for, I don't know, 25 years. It takes them that long to tell the truth on these things. The first time acknowledging the facts, which is that there is no credible evidence at all for rape on October 7th.
Yep.
All there is, as we've said from the start, are the claims of purported witnesses, so many of whom have been shown to be outright liars. And we showed that from the start. And finally, months later, one establishment Western media outlet has decided to catch up with us and the Electronic Intifada, with Mondo Weiss, with Z Squirrel, the Twitter account, with Middle Eastern women who also were putting this out. There was a feminist collective that put out a statement very early on drawing attention to this, but it took this long, 6-7 months, for a Western outlet to finally admit the facts that were always there.
Yeah, I think it is significant, even if they are relying on the intercepts method for research, which seems to be just to troll Max Blumenthal's Twitter post for a couple hours and then publish whatever they find.
Well, this is why they're after us. And it's kind of over now, even though they continue to recycle all these lies, especially for people who, as Wyatt said, are kind of media illiterate or want to believe the lies, for Zionist cultists and the cult of Ziontology, who need these lies in order to maintain their support for this genocide and believe that there's something just behind it all. That's why they're doing it. But sentient beings, people with critical faculties still intact, are seeing now that it's very clear. It's clear to everyone, I think, who's intelligent or politically educated, that the genocide was accompanied by a massive, massive manipulation, and that those who called it out are under attack and deserve support. And not just us, but there are so many other independent publications that helped along the way that deserve your support. Brianna Joy Gray is someone who is under enormous, she's the focus of Zionist attack right now. She was fired by the Hill Rising for rolling her eyes at someone who was spouting this hoax about Hamas mass rape on October 7th. Let's watch that clip real quick.
Thank you, me too. And I really hope that you specifically will believe women when they say that they got hurt.
All right, thanks for joining. Stick around, more Rising coming up next.
Watch again. Let's watch that again.
Thank you, me too. And I really hope that you specifically will believe women when they say that they got hurt.
All right, thanks for joining.
Well, I mean, Brianna's been calling out the Hamas rape hoax again and again on the Hill. That put a target on her back, but because she's on a semi-mainstream network debunking Israeli propaganda, Israel trained its propaganda networks fire on her, and they got sort of the scalp that they wanted when she lightly rolled her eyes at the sister of an Israeli captive in Gaza, declaring that she needs to believe Israeli women about what happened on October 7th, which was just a manipulative performance that, I mean, the only thing wrong that happened here was she didn't roll her eyes harder.
And she's explained she wasn't even rolling her eyes so much at this guest. She was rolling her eyes at the situation she was put in because basically according to her telling, her producers really pushed for that guest to be on. And Brianna said to them, well, I know that she's going to just try to basically be combative towards me. And that's going to put me in a bad position because I'm the host of the show. And my aim is to interview. It's not to debate people. And I don't want to be put in that situation where, because if you're the host, you have to be, sort of more respectful of the guests than you normally would be if you're on there to debate them. And so Brianna was uncomfortable with being put in that position. And so she explained that her eye roll was actually directed at the position that the producers put her in by having this guest repeatedly try to engage with her and basically make her out to be a rape apologist. And Brianna, being a host of the show, was not in a full position to defend herself because you have to be more gracious to a guest in that situation. So that's the explanation that she gave. And, but yeah, it's fair. Like, even on the substance of what the guest was saying, it's fair to roll your eyes at that claim, because again, I'm sorry, when it says believe women, in the case of the Israeli claims of Hamas rape, which women are you talking about? There are still no identified victims. There are no identified survivors. All there is are some people who claim to be witnesses. That's it. There's not one identified survivor of rape on October 7th. Not one, dead or alive.
As the Times of London points out.
Yeah. So when
and as the Pramila Patton report points out.
Yeah. So when they say believe women, again, you have to ask which women are you talking about?
Certainly not Palestinian women.
Well, no, certainly can't. No, of course not. But again, and the only known woman I believe who's spoken about, who's made allegations of rape on October 7th, is a witness identified as Sapir. I believe that's the only identified female witness who, quote unquote, witness. And what did Sapir say? Sapir is the same person who said that she witnessed a gang rape, that she witnessed necrophilia, she witnessed a woman's breast being cut off during the course of a rape, and that the militants started playing with the severed breast. And then she claimed that she saw Palestinian militants carrying 3 severed heads.
Yeah.
Somehow these 3 severed heads, there's no trace of them. And this got so embarrassing that the New York Times, after publishing Sapir's quote unquote testimony, and after we pointed out all the flaws in Sapir's claims, the New York Times lead author, Jeffrey Gettleman, wrote a follow-up piece a few weeks later in which he claimed that magically Israeli police had discovered 3 severed heads, which had been missing up until that point. I've been missing, I guess, until January. They magically discovered 3 severed heads. Of course, then he says they didn't provide any further detail. And they've not only provided no further detail to him, but to everybody else, because they haven't said a word about it publicly. So Jeffrey Gettleman's the only one who got this amazing scoop that after several weeks, 3 severed heads have magically appeared out of nowhere. And the Times of London pointed out that actually there are no severed heads because there's no forensic evidence to match any of these purported witnesses' claims. So that's the woman we're supposed to believe, someone who is telling a ridiculous tale and who is making claims that are supported by a grand total of 0 evidence.
Yeah. Where is Sapir? No one can find her.
And on the other side, I mean, you have finally mainstream media reporting on the state. How do you pronounce state Taiman? You have victims describing graphically firsthand accounts of rape, of sexual assault that happened to them. They get buried in 6 or 7 paragraphs down it, and they're not rape victims. They're patients at a shadowy hospital. You know that they're not. Their plight is basically dismissed as, and I'm referring obviously to the AP headline that referred to this torture detention camp as a shadowy hospital, as though it's simply operating in around the rules a little bit, maybe giving rhinoplasty to some patients that shouldn't be or something. But they have finally just been kind of introduced to the public record, to public awareness in the West. And where are the calls for any investigation? Where are the calls to believe all women, to believe all victims? Nowhere to be found. This news managed to basically stick around for about a day or two in mainstream media, and it's already been forgotten. But we're supposed to defer every day to these imaginary rape victims that no one can point to as as justification for Israel to continue its genocidal rampage.
I have to jump off here, so I'll say goodbye to you guys. Great to see you both. Thanks everybody for tuning in. I'll catch up with you next time.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Aaron, for
Bye.
joining us, and we'll see you next time. I tried to remove you and you're back. All right, you're gone. All right. So yeah, I mean, in closing, support Wyatt Reed, support the Grayzone. We are going to keep hitting back at these attacks. They're not done. It's going to be one of the craziest election seasons ever. They're going to blame everyone but themselves for Biden's demise. And all you got to do is go to spot.fund/WeFundTheGrayZone. Spot.fund/WeFundTheGrayZone. Just help us, fund the future for Wyatt Reed and other journalists like him. And to give a gigantic middle finger to the paper owned by one of the richest men in human history, who owns the CIA's cloud, who has a contract with the CIA to host its cloud. That's what we're up against here. And we're all up against it together. I'm going to be on Jimmy Dore talking about this in about 20 minutes. So I'm going to jump off, but we're going to have some very hard-hitting reporting coming up at the Grayzone this coming week. So look for that. Wyatt, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add.
I just wanted to send my appreciation to everyone who's donated and everyone who's reached out to me, everyone who's supported me in some way. It's been kind of a crazy week, but we are going to keep fighting no matter what they try to throw at us. And so it's much appreciated, everyone who has stood with us.
So big thanks to Wyatt for joining us and, standing tall under attack from the three-letter agencies and the paper that they control, the Washington Post. Eric T. Red, Eric Thomas is behind the boards helping us moderate the chat. Eric, if you want to drop the Spot Fund link in one more time, that would be much appreciated. Thanks for being there as always. And thanks to Christopher Weaver who helps us handle outreach, for pulling this Spot Fund crowdfunder together at the last minute to support Wyatt. And we will be, you can see me again in 15 minutes on Jimmy Dore, and we'll be back next week. So thanks again, everybody. Again, we can't do this without you. Peace. All right. I'm going to get ready for Jimmy. Good job.
I think we're still live.
Oh, well.